In this tutorial, you will learn how you can spawn a different enemy from a different point at end of the ground. I have tested with simple circles, triangle. You can replace this anyway with simple enemies or shooting one. I will have a link in the description how you can create simple enemy and shooting enemy. Okay, and you always gonna able to replace this with those. I hope you get the idea. So without further delay, let's get into this topic, how you can create or spawn a random enemy from a random point. So let's get into this. So let's create a enemy spawn enemy script. Okay, enemy spawner or something like that. Before, what we need two enemies, and to some points from there we just wanna spawn those enemies. To do so, let's create two enemies first. To do so, move to hierarchy. Okay, I'm gonna create a simple two enemies. I will have link in the description of videos how you can create simple enemies, shooting enemies and simple one. Okay, you can go ahead and check them out, but for in my case, for now I'm gonna create a simple to test enemies. Okay, to do so, let's move to hierarchy, right click or hit this plus icon, create and let's move to 2D object, then sprite. I'm gonna select this I guess circle one. I'm gonna name this to enemy one. For testing purposes I'm just creating. Okay, so I'm gonna change the color of this enemy circle or this enemy one a little bit darker so we can get a visual appealing. Okay, I'm gonna move this one over here. Let's create another enemy. To do so, let's click one more time in hierarchy, right click on it or hit this plus icon. Let's move to 2D object sprite. I'm gonna select this triangle for now. Let's move it down and let's choose the color to darker one, and let's rename this triangle to be enemy 2. Okay, sorry, enemy 2, enemy 2. And we also need to make a prefab of this game object, both of this game object. To do so, let's go move to assets, right click, create a folder. Let's call this folder to be enemy prefabs to make it a little bit organized and reasonable. Okay, so we have created this folder enemies prefab. So let's select both of them by holding down shift and move it to enemy, drag it to enemy prefab folder. Okay, now if I delete from this same view, we are fine. Now we can just directly drag it from our prefab folder. Okay, so if I select this ground parent game object, so we will create a some points. For now I'm gonna create a 2 points, and from there we will just spawn both of these enemies, but we will choose a random one and then try to spawn it. Okay, to do so, let's create 2 points. From there we just wanna spawn it. So I select the ground parent game object. Okay, this game object, and right click on it. Let's create an empty child game object. I'm gonna move this child game object over here. We want to just spawn from over here. So let's select an icon for it or gizmos. I'm gonna select this one, this green one, I guess. Fine, I'm gonna move this over here. Let's call this game object one to sorry, first point, first, sorry, first point, first point. And let's duplicate this one by control D. Okay, let's move this one at edge of the ground. I'm gonna move this first point a little bit further away from the second point. Let's call this first point one to second point, this one, second point. Okay, second point. Now it's fine. We can able to see it. We have created this child game objects, and there in front of there has been added a plus icon. So what we need to go over to this game object parent. Okay, click on overrides and click on apply all. So it will add up both of this game object in prefab also. To do so, click on apply. Okay, go move to overrides and apply all, apply all. So if I try to open up our ground parent game object now, prefab game object, by double clicking on it, we can able to see both of this style game object has been added to our prefab as well. So that is the reason on clicking overrides and apply also it will change in the prefab as well. So what we need a spawner, enemy spawner script, okay, to spawn a random enemy from this random point. We will choose a random one, and from there we will choose a random enemy, then we're gonna spawn it right away. Okay, to do so, let's create a enemy spawner script. Okay, let's move to assets, then scripts, right click on it, create C# script, name it to as enemy spawner or spawn enemy, and let's select this ground parent game object. Okay, this ground parent game object, and attach the script right there. Drag it to drag it Okay, drag it to this ground parent game object, that script. So I'm gonna drag this spawn enemy script right there to add component section. Okay, and click on override as we did for our two child game objects, the first point and the second point, and click on apply all, and double click that to open up in Visual Studio. Double click that to open up in Visual Studio. So we can see we have start and update function by default. So firstly what we need একটু sound কম করিস না we need to those game objects. So if I move to enemy prefabs, we have this both of this enemy, so we need both of this enemy to spawn it, and also we need both of these points to spawn from them. We have multiple ones, more than one. So we need to create an array, and we know array just array just a variable or which hold up multiple values. It can be name, it can be float numbers like 1 to 1.2, 1.5, or it can be integer values like 1 2 3 4, or it can be anything like game object. Points means the transform means the position one. So in our case we have these two game objects or enemy prefab game objects, so we need to create an array. So let's make it public so we can able to see over here in our script. If I select this ground parent game object in enemy spawn enemy script, so over here we will able to see that field. Okay, so public, and that is game object. Okay, game object we know, and we need to make this square brackets because we know that is game of array. Okay, basically we will hold up multiple values, or we need both of these enemy game objects, so that is the reason creating square brackets means array which will hold up multiple game objects. Okay, and we also have to name it, so let's call it enemies. And we also need make sure we also need this both of this point. So let's create transform. We can see both of this point has transform component, basically means it position, rotation, and scale. So let's create another array. Let's make it public so we can set through inspector. Transform means the position. Okay, position, and make square brackets because we have more than one. Let's call this one's enemy spawn position. Okay, enemy spawn position, to make it a little more cleaner. Position, and close that up with semicolon. Control S to save your code. Let's move to Unity, and we need to assign those variable first to use or spawn the enemy right away. So just wait for to compile. When it's done, assign those variables. In ground parent game object we attach our spawn enemy script. So select the ground parent game object and assign those variables. Okay, so I'm gonna select this ground parent game object. So we can able to see we have enemies which empty. Basically this array is empty now, so we need to drag both of this enemy right there, and also the both of this point. So you can see in the inspector top right corner lock button. Okay, so lock it first and select both of them by holding down shift and drag it to enemies. Okay, enemy prefab game objects or enemy list, and also do the same thing for this point. So select both of this point and move it to enemy spawn position there. So we have both of this point. So 0, we can see 0 is the first point, 1 is the second point, we can able to see that. And also 0 is the enemy 1 game object, and 1 is the enemy 2 game object, basically the index of it. 0 is the first one, means the index is 0 is the first one, so it's just map up with an certain index. Okay, so unlock it once you are done and go over to ground parents, click on overrides and apply all, so it will change in the prefab as well. So let's open up our enemy script. Okay, spawn enemy script. And what we want to do, we want to spawn the enemy once the player in it inside of that ground. Okay, inside of that ground. So we will remove this both of this function. Instead, what we want to do, we want to use on trigger inter 2D function. Okay, because if I select this ground parent game object and move to box collider 2D, we attach a box collider 2D to this ground parent game object and we set it is triggered to true, is triggered to true. So what we want to do over here, we will use this on trigger inter 2D function. Okay, on trigger inter 2D function, and this function get called when we trigger with something. But we definitely gonna trigger with this player game object. Once the player trigger with this box collider 2D, means this ground parent box collider, so this function get will get called out, and you can extract info whatever you have collided with or trigger it with by going to this other, like the game object or name of the game object, tag of the game object. So in our case, the player will just trigger with this box collider, so we're gonna able to see the player name right away in the console. Okay, right away on the console. So we will create a separate for function for spawning enemy. So we have to type void for function, and let's call this enemy, make first bracket and some curly brackets. So void, what we want to do inside of this function, we want to instantiate or spawn the enemy from those 2 points. To instantiate or spawn enemy, we have to use this instantiate function. Okay, and make this first bracket. And instantiate function over here will take the game object you want to spawn. It in our case, we want to spawn those enemies, so we have to pass as a first argument the enemy prefab game object, and the second thing, it will take the position from where you want to spawn. Okay, so we want to spawn it from both of this point. Okay, we will choose a random one, and from there we just want to spawn it right away. Okay, and the third thing, it will take the rotation. Okay, rotation, so we will pass quaternion dot identity, means no rotation. So as a first argument, let's pass our enemies. So we have to type this array name, which is enemies. Okay, this array name, and we also have to make this square brackets. So we can see 0 is the first enemy. If I move to ground parent game object and let's move to spawn enemy script, we can see 0 is the first enemy, 1 is the second enemy, basically the index of it. So if you pass 0, so 0 0, we can see this one, this enemy will be 0. If we to move to project tab, then prefab, sorry, enemy prefab, so 0, we can see circle 1, enemy 1, or the circle enemy is the first enemy, or the index of it 0, so it will be spawn the first enemy or the circle 1, comma, and the second thing, it will take the position. Okay, and so we have to pass the array name, in our case enemy position, enemy spawn position. Okay, and we also have to make square brackets. Okay, so we know 0 is the first point. If I select this 0 is the first one, 1 is the second point. Okay, so you can pass the index of it. So let's pass, let's suppose we want to spawn from the first point. Okay, first point, so let's put it 0 0, we know is the first point, and we also have to type dot position, because we know this transform is a position field. Okay, and the comma, and the third thing, it will take the rotation. So let's pass quaternion dot identity, it's basically means no rotation, and close that off with semicolon. Control S to save your code. So we also need to call this function we just made, but we never calling it, so this line of code will not be execute or call out, so it will not spawn our enemy. So we spawning the first enemy at first point with no rotation, we can able to see that. So let's call this function function whence the player trigger with that box collider 2D as you seen. So we need to firstly check if the box collider or the ground parent box collider is really collided with the player or not. So we will check if other, okay, other dot tag, if other dot tag, if it's equals to player, okay, player, and make some curly brackets. So in this case, so we know on trigger inter 2D function get call when we trigger with something, and we are checking whatever we have triggered it with, if that game object has tag player. So we know we definitely gonna trigger with that player game object. Okay, player, so basically the player will get inside of that ground or the box collider. So we want to call this function, and we know what this function is doing. Okay, so let's call this function spawn, and make first bracket and close that off with semicolon, controllers to save your code. So in spawn function, and what in spawn function is doing, it's just spawning the first enemy at first point with no rotation we can able to see. So control S on your keyboard to save your code. Let's move to Unity and hit this play button in the top. Once the player get inside of this box collider or the ground parent game object, we're gonna able to see the first enemy which will be spawned at first point, because we have specified the index which is 0, and we know 0 is the first point, and also 0 for the first enemy. So if I hit this play button in the top and select the ground parent game object, if I hit this play button in the top and click on overrides and apply, also it will change in the prefab as well. If you want to have it multiple times, and you are done. So we did some mistake, I guess. Okay, so I guess, so what we need, it's working fine basically. Firstly we need to check if we really collided with the player or not. So if I select this player game object, we also need to assign this player game object as a player tag, because we just checking whatever we have triggered it with checking if the game object has player tag. But we know in any game object of hierarchy has doesn't have the player tag we can see, so this function will never calling out. So we want to just only assign this player game object as a player tag. To do so, let's select the player game object, move to inspector in the right, and select which is untagged to player. Now we assigned this player as a player tag, and click on overrides and apply, also it will change in the prefab as well. Let's hit this play button, and now if we try to just get inside of this box collider or trigger with that of ground parent, that spawn function will call out, and we know what spawn function is doing, it just printing out. So as you can see, the circle enemy gets spawned at the first point. Okay, we can able to see multiple times. Okay, so over here we can see the circle enemy we know is the first enemy, and it just printing out at the first point. So instead of printing out specific enemy at specific position, we want to choose a random one, enemy, and choose a random point. From there we just wanna spawn. So I'm gonna hit unplay one more time. Let's move to script one more time. Okay, let's move to script once again, and we will create an random dot range function. Okay, random dot range function, a range function, and this function over here, okay, it will take the first position or minimum inclusive and float mix inclusive. So as a first we will pass the 0, we will start from that, and this will be our enemies, so we will pass enemies dot length. Okay, and close that up with semicolon. So random dot range function over here will take a random number. Okay, it can be 0, and enemies dot length means how many enemy we have. We know we have 2 enemies. If I move to project, then enemy prefab, we can see we have 2 enemies, so the enemies dot length over here will be 2. So the random dot range function over here will take between 0 and 2, but it will not include 2, but it will definitely gonna include 0 and 1. but it can be random because we using this random dot range function, which take the random value or a random number between this. Enemies dot length mean how many enemy we have two, so it will not include two, but we definitely gonna include 0 and 1. So let's store it, let's store the result or whatever we got into a integer value, because the result will be integer 1. So let's call this integer and let's call it random enemy instead, and let's set equal to this. So the random enemy will be a random enemy index instead, call this, it will be fine. So random enemy index, so it can be 0 and 1 because random dot range function over here will take a random number. It can be 0 and 1, but it will definitely gonna not include this enemies dot length, means how many enemies we have. So in our case 2, so this becomes 2, so it can be 0 and 1. So let's suppose this becomes 1, so the random enemy index over here will be 1, and we know 1 is the second enemy, but we know this random dot range function will pick up a random number, not the specifically 1 or 0. So let's replace this 0 with enemies array with this random enemy index, and we know it will be random 1. Okay, this will be random 1, it can be 0 and 1. So let's do the same thing as we did for our this random enemies. Okay, so control C for copying it, and let's paste it down by control V. Let's call this one to be this one to be random position, let's call it instead random position index. Let's call it random position index, and let's replace this enemies dot length with this enemy spawn position dot length. Okay, enemy spawn position dot length, and we know enemy spawn position dot length mean how many points we have. We know we definitely have 2 points. We can see in our spawn enemy script we have 0 is the first one, 1 is the second one, so we have only 2 points. So this enemies dot position dot length becomes 2, so we know, so 0 is the first point. Okay, it will include 0 and 1, and it will not gonna definitely include the 2. So this becomes with random dot range function will pick up a random one, it can be 0 and 1. So the random position index will be 0 and 1, it can be 0, and if it becomes 0, 0 is the first one, but if it becomes 1, so 1 is the second point. But we know it will be random 1 because we have using this random dot range function. So let's replace this as a 0 with the specific one with this random position index, which can be 0 and 1. Okay, 0 and 1. So control S to save your code. Let's move to Unity and let's see the result, what's really happening. We know it will pick up a random enemy first, and after it will choose a random position, and from there the enemy will be spawned, a random enemy will be spawned. So just wait for to see that. Control S to save your code, and let's hit play in the top and see the result, what's really happening. Okay, what's really happening. So just wait for to compile. So I'm gonna compile. Okay, so we can see the circle enemy gets spawned at second point. We can able to see the enemy just getting spawned. Okay, from a random point we can able to see. Okay, I hope you get the idea how you can spawn a random enemy from a random point we can able to see. But you can do instead of once we trigger with the box collider or get to a first ground parent, and then it just getting the spawn. You can do it anywhere you want. Okay, before it we can you can make a timer, I guess, and timer, and then you can spawn it. It's up to you how you want to have. So I hope you get the idea how you can spawn a random enemy from a random position.